Hi, my name is Don Jones, and this is the ultimate class for Windows PowerShell covering every version that you might have in production. This nugget is your series introduction, and I'll also cover some information about what you'll need if you want to follow along and do your own lab. Now, this series is a little bit different from many of the CBT Nugget series that you may be familiar with. For one, this one is huge. I've actually broken it down into a number of different sections, and each section has several different nuggets that kind of contribute to that. You can look at the nugget names and you'll be able to see these same session titles. For example, I guess let's start with where we are right now, which is PowerShell Core. So this is going to cover some of the main stuff that you need to know to make PowerShell useful. And then we're going to get into PowerShell remoting. Now that, I think, is one of the coolest things you can do with PowerShell. The ability to reach out from one computer and manage multiple other computers simultaneously in parallel. Closely related to that, we've got Windows Management Instrumentation and SIM, the Common Information Model, a way of collecting management information and in some cases making changes to it. We'll also talk about background jobs, getting PowerShell doing more than one thing for you. And then we'll finally dive into actual scripting. And this is where PowerShell starts to become a little bit like a programming language, I guess you could say. And we're going to start automating entire processes that way. Now, a key part of that are these things called script commandlets. That's what I call them, what some folks call them. They're officially called advanced functions. They're a great way of building your scripts in a way that makes them look and smell and feel and taste just like a real PowerShell command. Then we'll get into some advanced scripting techniques, take things a little bit further. And this is a great section. This is what I call PowerShell in the field. It's a chance to take all the things we've done up to that point and use them in some really production appropriate ways to accomplish some real tasks using all that stuff. Then we're going to start really ramping into some of PowerShell's more advanced features, including workflow and desired state configuration. We're also going to have a section I call writing scripts for other people. Now, this is when you're writing a script, but you really want to create it as a tool. In fact, I use the word tool making instead of scripting because you want to write a script that someone else can consume without really knowing much about what happens inside. And then we'll wrap up this series with a huge section on advanced core techniques, tips, and tricks. So we definitely have got a massive range of things to cover. Pretty much everything an administrator can do with Windows PowerShell is going to be done in this series. And one of the things I'm going to throw at you with each section, and sometimes in the middle of sections, is a hands-on lab. I'm actually going to give you written lab instructions for a task that I want you to accomplish, and then I'll take an entire nugget and set it aside to go over how I think I would accomplish that particular task. It doesn't mean what you do is wrong if it's different from mine. It's just a way of giving you a variety of perspectives. But to do that, you're going to need some kind of lab environment to work with. At a minimum, I recommend you have a Windows 8 or later client computer to work with. Now, if you want to kind of go back and forth between the different versions of PowerShell, then you're going to need multiple different client computers to work with. That's why I've also got a Windows 7 computer over here that I'm going to be able to play with. Now, some of the stuff we're going to do really does play into servers. So let me outline kind of my entire lab environment here. I'm starting with a domain controller. And I've got, as I said, a Windows 8 client computer and a Windows 7 client computer. I've also got a member server. So this domain, lab.pri, has got 4 different computers in it. It has a forest trust, a two-way forest trust with a completely separate forest called remote.pri, which simply has a domain controller in it. And there's also another forest, which has no trust with anybody, it's very untrusting, called foreign.pri, which also has a domain controller in it. Most of this complexity is here for when we start talking about Windows PowerShell remoting, because going across forests and to untrusted forests is where things get interesting and complex with remoting. So from a day-to-day lab perspective, you certainly don't need all of this. You could get by with a single test domain that has a domain controller and a client computer. You could get by with just a client computer, but if you really want to kind of play around, have that domain controller too. Now, there's a few different ways you could build this out. Obviously, if you've got a copy of Windows 8, it's got Hyper-V built right into it. So if you've got hardware that's capable of running Hyper-V on Windows 8, I'll just spin up a couple virtual machines. In fact, you can go to Microsoft's website, and if you do a little Google search or Bing search for VHD test drive, you're going to find some pre-installed virtual hard disks, virtual machines, that you can download and run in Hyper-V. And that'll give you a domain controller, it can give you a client computer, and you won't have to do much to set it up. Alternately, if you want to set everything up from scratch, you can download the trial versions, the eval versions of both the client operating system and the server operating system. Now, I'm not going to show you how to promote a domain controller or anything. If you're kind of coming in here, you should already be at that level of admin. You should know how to build yourself a domain controller and know how to get the OSs installed. So it's a couple of ways to do it. Now, if you live in countries where it's available, there's another service you might look into called CloudShare. They have a trial period that you can use. It's not a very expensive service. You do have to pay for it if you want to use it. But essentially, it'll let you build up to 6 virtual machines in a cloud. And they don't run them all the time, and that's one of the reasons they're fairly inexpensive. This isn't like building something in Azure or Amazon Web Services. They're actually going to let you spin up from templates. So they've already got pre-created domain controllers and client computers and all that. So you can very, very quickly get a lab environment up and running. You access it via a little web viewer browser thing that they give you. You can also get in via remote desktop, of course. And that's going to be a great way to get a lab up and running that you can access from anywhere. It does cost a little bit, so it's something to check into, but I wanted to make sure you had several different options to work with in terms of getting a lab going. And again, you're going to be able to do most of what I'm showing you with just a client computer. You don't need anything more than that. Certainly it gets more interesting when you have more computers to play with, and you'll be able to practice a wider variety of things, but don't feel that you're going to be left out if all you can get your hands on is a client computer. Our PowerShell to-do list is not going to get any shorter just sitting here yapping, but before we go on to the real meat of this, I want to kind of point out the methodology I'm going to use. In every one of the upcoming nuggets, I'm going to start with version 2 of Windows PowerShell. There's a lot of folks who are using that in production, and they will probably be around for a while. Now, version 2 runs on Windows XP or later on the client OS, and on the server side, it's Windows Server 2003 and later. Then, toward the end of each nugget, I'll cover what was new or changed, and usually it's just new, in version 3, which is available for Windows 7 and later, and Windows Server 2008 and later. And after that, I'll cover what's new or changed, again, mostly new, in version 4. Which is Windows 7 and later, and Windows Server 2008 R2 and later. That way, no matter what version of PowerShell you're using, or if you're in a mixed environment, you'll be completely clear on what happens in each version, what you can do in version 3 that you couldn't do in version 2, and there won't be any confusion about the version-y back and forthy stuff. So I think by laying it out that way, you'll be able to stay on track, understand what's going to work in your environment, and what you might be limited to if you're using an older version of Windows PowerShell. Okay, that's all the preliminaries, so let's get started.